Hey, so hello and welcome back, and this is going to be a sort of continuation off of the last installment, which was about railroad-driven tourism in the western United States, and I did mention sticking a pin in the talk about Native Americans and how this related at least with the Santa Fe and the Harvey House Company. So this is going to be the episode where we're going to be getting into that. So the Santa Fe Railroad and the Fred Harvey Company, which was its business partner that managed all of its ancillary businesses like hotels and restaurants and sleeping cars and resorts and whatnot. Both had a very close relationship with the Native American tribes that lived along the railways in Arizona and New Mexico. The relationship had some interesting outcomes for the tribes at the time when there was very little good news for pretty much any tribe in the United States. And this doesn't mean that this relationship was ideal, but any good relationship that a tribe could forge was welcome news after westward expansion. And as I said, this is also the episode of not only will I be going into tourism, but a little bit of how land grants worked and how they were used to build the railroads in general. So to start off, after the U.S. acquired the Louisiana Purchase in the 1800s, the U.S. had its eyes on expanding to the Pacific Ocean. There was always a yearning to spread civilization, quote-unquote, across the continent. The U.S. may have had sovereignty over the land in the European sense, or at least west of the Mississippi, but it didn't have it in the effective sense because land was basically inhabited by the tribes at this point, or at least post-War of 1812, and the occasional fur trappers that have gone west to trap beavers. The West wasn't really of interest until after gold was discovered in California, and until this point, as far as I can remember, the Oregon Territory was administered jointly between the U.S. and Britain, and the gold rush and subsequent flood of people into this part of the country made them realize, oh, this land's actually worth living in, so more people started moving west and whatnot, and this also led to displacement of the local tribes on what became the West Coast, but I'm not really going into that because the settlement of California was the impetus to build the railroads, and this is about the railroads and yada yada yada. This is about the impact of the railroads directly, not the impact of other aspects of westward expansion that happened before them. Anyways, the short of the story is that the land in California, Oregon, and Washington was far more valuable to farmers and everyone else than the land in between the Mississippi and the Sierras. Part of this was down to people thinking the land was worthless because there wasn't obvious sources of water like rivers and lakes and ponds and whatnot, and the land was harder to plow. And both of these were eventually overcome by technology, which made the Great Plains more attractive later on, mostly post-Civil War. I mean, there were settlements before the Civil War because bleeding Kansas and all that stuff, but it was mostly afterwards where it became the real center of attention. And a lot of the land of the Great Plains was still seen as worthless until energy sources such as coal, oil, and uranium were discovered, which was farther down the road. And even if they were discovered earlier, the first few land grants given out to the railroads, they didn't have mineral rights, and railroads didn't always get the best land because they kind of got land at random, and so basically the land was still seen as not worth as much, and there was also trouble with the Native Americans because they were hostile, continuingly hostile, and very justifiably hostile towards people moving west, because, I mean, wouldn't you if your land is getting invaded or at least used as a highway to, I don't know, people to move wherever. But what do the railroads have to do with this? So the transcontinental railways were funded partly through land grants and partly through bonds backed by the federal government, and the bonds were increased based on whether the land was flat, slightly hilly, or mountainous, among which other requirements were that the grades not exceed 2% over a mile and a curve couldn't exceed 10 degrees, and that the maximum bond was for $48,000 per mile, and the cost to build in the series was $100,000 per mile, on top of having to use American-made steel. Really hurt the Central Pacific in their attempt to build east. But the sweeteners to these deals, that they would get land around the railroads and how it was done. So we'll do a quick lesson on how land was surveyed before. At least land was surveyed as we started moving west of the Appalachians, so they were in these grid squares. So one side was 6 miles, so from 1 to 6 miles, and then down to 36, which is 6 miles, so it was 36 square miles in one gigantic square. That was called a township. And then each of this was subdivided into 36 1 square mile sections, which is kind of why a lot of the middle of the country is square. The land would be reserved for various functions. Some of it was kept by the federal government. Some of it was given to the states for various purposes, like funding the land grant universities. The land was either sold or leased or whatever to fund these universities. Some of it was kept for K-12 education for the same deal, either usually to rent or sell it off to fund the schools. And from what I understand, some of the land would be like assigned to being like this square mile or whatever is going to have a town in it, or there whatever. Like if it was a town, it would be broken up into smaller bits, usually connected to a railroad at some point. But anyways, what land the federal government did keep in all of this crazy mess was sold off for $15 for a 160-acre plot of land, and the railroads would sell the equivalent amount of land for around $800, and people would, choose to buy from the railroads because the railroads were more invested in the success of the farmer or tradesperson or whatever than the federal government was, because if you bought it from the government, you could end up with basically 160 acres of sand, at least as you move further west. Oh, and how the railways would get land out of this. So if I remember to color in a line on this, hopefully I will, between 24 and 25. Basically, so it would run along the line. Usually it would run in a wavy pattern, it wouldn't run directly. So it would run through. After it run through, the land on either side of the railway, they would get the odd numbered sections. So they would get, if it went through, they'd get 29, 17, 5 for 10 miles out. So they'd get 5 little squares, and then same thing going down. They'd get, for 10 miles going away from the railway, they'd get the odd numbered squares, and that's the land that they would get to sell off, and in some ways actually they'll still own to this day, or at least sold off more recently, because some of the land wasn't really good for agriculture, but later they found coal and oil and natural gas and all that fun stuff, and then leases and sales were used for that. But anyways, as more people came, the natives were displaced, which meant they were, herded onto reservations, which was almost usually the worst land possible, and the reservations were created to assimilate the Indians into Native American culture, into American culture. God, if I could English correctly. This was done, and a lot of the two tribes that were generally, some were not always previously farming or sedentary tribes. A lot of them were rivals, and they were forced to share reservations with each other, which meant starvation, disease, and conflicts arise between all the rival groups over scarce resources. And this was on top of the reservations essentially being open-air prisons, because they generally weren't allowed to leave without the permission of the federal government. Not only did the federal government try to force agriculture and modern ways of life onto a society that didn't have much experience with them, but the federal government also forced families to send their kids to boarding schools that would force American ways of life onto the kids, with military discipline, which included not speaking their own language or practicing their own religion or using their own native fashion and whatnot. So basically it was just to destroy their way of life as much as they possibly could. What ended up happening to the tribes that survived the first few decades of reservation life was the thorough, not complete destruction of their culture, but a very thorough pillaging of it, massive amounts of poverty and alcoholism, because usually, if you've had your life thrown up this much, you're going to get, end up poor, see, the Rust Belt, and that usually follows some sort of substance abuse. See, I guess a modern example would be the opioid crisis. Back then it was alcohol, because that was pretty much the only thing available, at least in large quantities and large extents. But this wasn't the norm for all the tribes in the United States. The tribes of New Mexico and Arizona fared a different fate than the tribes in other parts of the country, and this survival and later success happened at first to the chagrin of the federal government. As mentioned in a previous video, the Santa Fe Railroad wanted to promote the Southwest as a vacation destination. This led them to building hotels and resorts to cater to Eastern tourists. And at the time, anthropologists were studying the tribes of New Mexico and Arizona, since these were some of the last tribes in the U.S. that hadn't suffered the worst effects of westward expansion. They were being forced onto reservations, yes, but their society hadn't changed as quickly, since fewer people wanted to live in the desert, so there was less external pressure from settlers to change them. The studies and the circulation of these studies in magazines like Harper's Weekly intrigued the wealthy and rising middle class of the East Coast, and seeing the business opportunity to Santa Fe opened the Montezuma Resort outside of Las Vegas, New Mexico, which was the rival of any resort in America at the time. Since the Fred Harvey Company ran the Montezuma, it eventually smelled other business opportunities. So the Fred Harvey Company was the operating company of the Santa Fe, owned hotels, resorts, station restaurants, dining cars, and yada yada yada, basically every ancillary business that you can have anywhere near a train station. If it was run by the Santa Fe or tacitly owned by them, it was run by Fred Harvey. They grew out of the Santa Fe's need to feed its passengers, and they were contracted to basically run everything. And they also started spin-off companies, which included a tour company based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, called Indian Detours. And on the trips arranged by this company, you would go on a 1, 2, or 3 day trip for people to experience a quote-unquote authentic Indian culture in New Mexico, and this included visiting pueblos around Santa Fe, visiting ruins, and getting lectures from people who had degrees in history about the local tribes. This later included a museum across the street from the hotel. I believe it was either in Albuquerque or Santa Fe, I can't remember which. And then there was the Hopi Museum at the Grand Canyon. These tours had a profound impact at a time when the federal government was trying its hardest to erase Indian cultures from existence. The tribes of New Mexico had been facing nearly 400 years of cultural assimilation, which started with the Spanish superficially Christianizing them. By that, the tribes just basically added Jesus into their pantheon and continued to practice their religion in secret, which was periodically harshly punished by the Catholic authorities, which led to a few rebellions against the Spanish, because, what isn't Spanish colonialism in the Americas without a rebellion? By the time American tourists were visiting the Pueblos with the Fred Harvey Company in the early 20th century, the Pueblos were used to keeping everything a secret, which helped them evade the federal authorities. These visits were very much like how people would go on safari in Africa today. They experienced a local culture, bought some stuff, and then went back to their hotel with all their modern comforts. This was a fairly cheap and performative restoration of Pueblo and Navajo culture, but it did allow them to preserve their culture in a time of hostility from the federal government. The traditional quote-unquote ceremonies the visitors would be seeing wouldn't be as authentic as an actual ceremony or event, but it gave the tribes a bigger reason to preserve their culture. It was their way of making money. This isn't to say that things are or were perfect for these tribes or even good enough. The Navajo Reservation still has very troubling statistics to this day, like over 16,000 homes still without electricity and a median income of $20,000. Which is about 2/3 of what it is in the rest of America, which is still atrociously low. But making money also had another impact on the Navajo and Pueblo cultures. They started selling their handicrafts such as turquoise jewelry, pottery, blankets, and carpets. This led to the refinement of their craft, which further increased people's desire to buy these items and even made a few craftsmen and women famous in their day. Not only that, but this gave the tribe a source of income, which made them more independent and stable compared to other tribes that were subjugated to the allotment policy, which was basically a way of giving off reservation land to a family to farm, which frankly isn't going to work in the middle of the desert as well as it would somewhere further east or north, but it still didn't really have good success, or even I think pretty much had negative success if I'm remembering my history correctly. Basically, the Native American policies were basically assimilationist and basically all failed in the long run. This also led to the women's advancement in tribal society, which is still honestly kind of a problem with some tribes to this day, because I read a thing from one of my Native American friends who actually did go over how like some of their tribes still don't have gender equality, which is weird, but different video or different channel topic. Anyway, so the tribes that had a tourist economy not only had the best lives by comparison, still horrible compared to the rest of America, but they were, improving or doing better, or at least not as screwed. Basically, they were somewhere between like absolute horrible poverty of most tribes, but not quite up to regular American poverty, or at least white American poverty. They were probably up to like pre-civil rights era African American poverty. But they were carving out a niche in American society, which gave them the capacity to preserve their culture in spite of the wishes of the federal government. And to draw a parallel, these tribes were able to do the same thing that immigrants have been able to do in this country, which is empower and self-improvement on their terms, rather than the paternalistic terms that were forced onto them by the federal government. Now, I know, caveat is they are not immigrants, we are the immigrants, but the point is, though, is that they are able to do what they wanted on their terms, not the terms of the federal government or the terms... Honestly, yeah, the federal government, because no one else really gave a crap at this point unless you were living near them. The Indians had far more barriers and outright oppression than most immigrant groups that came to America, but the groups that were able to take the bull by the horns and change on their own is how a group integrates into a new or changing society. Not necessarily saying that integration is the best, but becoming at least part of the society is better than trying to be outside of it and ignored and basically treated with contempt. What happened can't be undone, but empowering groups like the Indian tribes and letting them develop on their own is how to have groups be a part, again, as a part of society rather than being obliterated and then having their bits absorbed, as in take the group, shatter it into its individuals, and then try to reabsorb them, which is honestly that's never been the case for any society, let alone what we've done to the natives or immigrants or frankly anybody, because human societies are just a complex web tapestry or whatever metaphor you want to put in here, but they're not just atomized individuals existing diluted in a sea of freedom and apple pie and eagles or some crap. Other things that were done at this time that some people may or may not, that people now would see as good or bad depending on the person's persuasion, is that the Santa Fe and the Fred Harvey Company would procure arts and goods to sell them. When the Santa Fe furnished the super chief, it commissioned art from Indian craftspeople and other artists. The Santa Fe was leaning into the image of them being the railroad of the Southwest, and this image included a lot of what we would consider Southwestern like art and imagery today, which is a lot of Pueblo and Navajo inspired imagery. And Santa Fe wanted to lead into this image as much as possible, so it commissioned authentic art to support this image. And the Fred Harvey Company under Mary Coulter, who was the chief architect of the Fred Harvey Company in the 1920s and 30s, had the same opinion and wanted to just decorate things in the most authentic way possible. One of the best examples of this relationship was the decoration of the El Navajo Hotel in Gallup, New Mexico, which is decorated with Navajo sand paintings. These sand paintings are considered sacred by the Navajo and generally weren't painted outside of sacred areas. But the Fred Harvey Company had actually had such a good relationship with the tribes that they allowed these arts to be commissioned anyways. And then we were blessed by medicine men before the hotel opened. And the El Navajo was also the focal point of an event called the Intertribal Ceremonials, which was just an event with the Native American tribes of the region, and were basically the Fred Harvey Company was included in many of their events over time, and events of the Native Americans, not events of this group. And this was this event in specific was the only time the Harvey girls wore a uniform outside of their own standard like black leggings and white skirt or whatever it was. This relationship and these activities would be seen as good and bad by others for different reasons. It would be seen as good because it was authentic. In some ways, it gave the tribes a way to be economically independent, to preserve their culture and adapt to a changing world on their own terms. The bad side of this is that the Indians were an oppressed group and the tourists were not getting an authentic feel, or authentic enough for academics in an ivory tower of today would consider authentic, because academia. And commissioning art is exploitation, even if it allowed their culture to survive in a society that wanted to destroy their culture. The idea of exploitation kind of stems from the Marxist notion that any exchange under capitalism is exploitative to one side of the exchange by definition, and since the Indians were the disadvantaged group, they were being exploited no matter what the arrangement was. The idea that this interaction wasn't authentic enough comes from academics sitting in universities trying to determine what a group they don't belong to should share with outsiders, which as far as I'm concerned is none of their goddamn business, since I at least believe in individual and group self-determination over what serves the interest of people who have no stake in the situation. And the tribes that were herded onto land to be separate from the rest of society, to eventually be atomized into individuals and reabsorbed, have a claim to self-determination on that alone, along with all the treaties that we've signed recognizing their sovereignty, even if the federal government has played jump rope with that commitment over the last 2 centuries. The notion that this was a good situation is based on people's notion of fair trade. My opinion on this is that it may have not been ideal for the first generations to be in this situation, but a few generations later, the situation has paid off in some regards, even if it's still an imperfect situation, that at least some change was able to be made on their terms and has at least somehow contributed to maybe making more change in the future. But that again is more of a perspective on the life thing rather than some trying to come up some objective good. But these tribes were able to preserve their culture, which is more concrete. The tourism was able to change the rest of society's mind about what it means to be Indian, and ultimately the Indians themselves have changed less to survive than other tribes have had to. So this brings us to today, which brings us to BNSF, and BNSF is the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, and is the only railroad to have in North America to have an official part of the company that deals with tribal relations. So the BNSF serves 25 tribes along its railroad, and they have an outreach, and according to BNSF, it has formalized the relationships with the predecessor railroads, or at least it has formalized the relationships that its predecessors has had with the natives for whatever they were, which these relationships include things like general train safety training, so don't go on the tracks, pay attention to the bells and the gates and whatnot, economic development tribes, but also includes sponsoring scholarships for the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, and they also helped support the pandemic response with the Yakima Peacekeepers in Washington State. So to say that nothing good can come of this is kind of a false statement. Yes, things were bad in the past, and I'm not going to say that things were perfect or things were ideal or things were even remotely good, but that society is a long march towards something that is hopefully better for humans in general, and that things change slowly over time, and that this is just one step in that change, and that things will continue to change going forward. But what that ideal future is may not necessarily be up to us, because if you're not a Native American listening to this, it's not my job to tell you, as someone who's not a Native American, what your future should hold, and that is up to you to determine. But at least hopefully we're getting to a point in society where we're actually having the conversation of you doing what you want and the rest of society supporting that to try to make up for past wrongs is at least a much healthier place to be than we're trying to obliterate your entire social fabric and try to reabsorb the individuals as if people can be completely a society can be rendered unto its individuals and then reabsorbed into a bigger one. But again, that's just my opinion and my perspective on life, which I know a lot of people are probably going to disagree with, and I'm sorry if you do that, but again, disagreements happen in the comments. Thank you for listening, and hopefully you will enjoy and listen to more or yell at me in the comments. Anyways, have a good day.